Good morning, everyone, and good evening to those of you joining us from the US. My name is Frederick Nyberg. I'm the Managing Director for MedTech Innovator Asia Pacific, based here in Singapore with my colleague Bernice. Thank you so much to the cohort participants joining us today, and to those of you watching on YouTube. As Bernice mentioned, this is our 8th webinar in this series, and today's topic is building advisory boards and establishing overseas entities. Really, two topics really, and a really interesting set of topics. And I think what makes this session perhaps unique is that we're taking the perspective here of many of the startup companies that are in our cohort, and to them it's really about, how do I scale, how do I establish myself overseas outside of my home market, and how do I find the right talent and the right advisors to help me through that journey. So that's really is the focus of today's session. We have an outstanding panel. I'll introduce our panelists here in just a moment. Just a few words on MedTech Innovator before then, for those of you who may not be familiar with who we are. We are the world's largest accelerator for traditional medical devices, digital health, and in vitro diagnostics. Well over 600 companies will have gone through our accelerator by the end of this calendar year. They've gone on to raise $7 billion in follow-on equity. And you do have the opportunity, if you're coming to Singapore in early December, to meet all of the 24 companies that are in the Asia Pacific 2023 cohort. We'll be at the grand finals in collaboration with APAC Med at their MedTech Forum at Suntec here in Singapore. If you're interested in what we do, or if you're keen to apply, reach out to us after the event. In terms of logistics, very quickly for our cohort, you're familiar with the how we ask questions here. You can either use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, or just raise your hand and we'll get to questions at the end of the session. So with that, I will turn to my panelists. A warm welcome, Brian Apple from Wilson Sonsini and Steve Johnson from GA Executive Search. Brian is dialing in from Palo Alto, California, and Steve is dialing in from Sydney. So I'll have our speakers briefly introduce themselves, tell us a bit about their company, and share some examples of work that you typically do with your medtech clients. And I'll turn to Brian first, if you don't mind. Welcome.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks, Frederick. Glad to be with everybody here this evening, depending where you're at. My name is Brian Apple. I'm an attorney with Wilson Sonsini. We're one of the largest firms that's native to Silicon Valley. And within Wilson Sonsini, I work in our MedTech corporate practice group. We've got about 800 clients, mostly in MedTech, also in kind of adjacent life sciences verticals. But primarily within the medtech space. And we represent those clients from formation, from initial incorporation, kind of idea on a napkin, all the way through successive financing rounds. That's where we spend a lot of our time helping our clients raise money and build their companies, through kind of expanding, ramping operations, and then all the way through to exit. So we help out with the M&A at the end. And along the way, we advise regarding scientific advisory boards, among other things. So happy to be with you here.
Thanks for that, Brian. And I should add that Wilson Sonsini is a MedTech Innovator partner and has been for many years. And for those of you who were at our MedTech Innovator Summit back in June in San Francisco, of course, the final day was done in partnership with Wilson Sonsini at their annual medical device conference. Steve, great to see you again. Welcome to the panel. Tell us a bit about your background and what you do for the MedTech sector.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation, Frederick. Delighted to be here. My background, I started out in the pharmaceutical industry, but moved into executive search, joining a global firm in about 97. I was sent to Sydney to establish an Asia-Pac, what was then called a healthcare practice. So I did that while delivering assignments for in a lot of other sectors, but eventually was able to sustain a life sciences practice from around about 2002 or so. Set up on my own in 2004. and built a team and have been pretty much doing the same thing. Teams gotten smaller and bigger as time's gone on. GFC impacted us. Changes to government policy here in Australia for subsidised drugs that sort of cost us a little bit. But, I've basically been doing the same thing for some time. At the moment, I'm dividing my time sort of 70-30 medtech to pharma, whereas it's been the other way around in the past. They're doing a lot more in medtech, and the sort of organisations I've been doing, which is executive search, hiring senior executives into organisations. The majority, I have to say, are affiliates of multinational corporations and Australian listed medtech companies as well. Some very, very small, and some getting onto small, medium, but global still. So typically the kind of roles I might source are CEOs, general managers, CEOs and general management generally, but also CMOs, chief marketing officers, but also people in medical affairs, reg affairs, compliance, supply chain, finance and financial management. Most functions are pretty well covered. And as I pointed out too, including the commercial ones as well as the technical ones. So that's pretty much me in a nutshell, I think. And also I've worked across China, Southeast Asia, and obviously Australia and New Zealand, and have done that since around about 2004 as well.
Great, thanks, Steve, for that. And before we dive into the topics here of specifically looking at advisory boards and looking at setting up overseas entities, just a few general questions about talent acquisition. And I'll turn to Steve maybe first on this. So as I may have mentioned, we typically survey our cohort startups at the beginning of the accelerator. We ask them to flag some specific questions they have about a range of topics. What sort of keeps them awake at night? And a question that comes back again and again. I think I'll have to ask you to be relatively brief here because it's a broad topic. Is how do I, as a medtech startup, attract top talent? How can I compete with a large multinational to get the right people into the right positions, whether it's in my home market or somewhere else? Just a few high-level thoughts on that, Steve, from putting you on the spot here a little bit.
You know me well by telling me to keep it short. Look, there's no simple answer, as you pointed out. I mean, size, budget, commercialization, timing, how sexy your technology is, because that has a big factor on how you attract candidates. If your technology is unrecognized, as in not looking sexy yet, but we know in 18 months, 2 years' time, people are going to go crazy, then that obviously is a harder sell at that point in time. So that would be my first second. The second ideal scenario actually is for startups to have an executive search partner with them, or a recruiter who at least understands your industry and understands your sector and can get into bed with you and understand your product and your technology. Because those sort of longer term partnerships with a talent advisor, if you like, and you know what, you could probably have someone internally to do that as well. But externally, if you can afford to engage with a search firm, the difference it makes across a range of areas is actually quite impactful. We search guys, we're out there basically fertilizing your ideas, what's happening in your organization. And guess who we talk to 90% of the time is people in your industry. So our audience is very specific, and those people talk and word gets out and your brand rises. So if you can build into your initial budget, not all organizations do this, especially smaller ones who are running on an oily rag, and for them are probably other strategies you need to look at. But if you can afford and build in a recruitment budget, a budget for the recruitment of initially maybe 2 to 5 key executives, then that can have a fairly big impact on your chances of success down the track, rather than relying on your own networks to continually sort of staff your teams, because that's frankly is a very narrow and quite a small area. Now, I'm speaking for APAC. I'm not speaking for the US, which is very different, where a lot of startups often have the budgets to be able to do these things as they do in Europe. But certainly in Australia, the budgets aren't there, and most startups don't engage with a recruiter. or they'll engage with a contingency recruiter who will run an ad for them, which they can do themselves anyway. So, in a nutshell, hopefully I've kept that short enough.
Yeah, no, that's helpful, Steve. Thanks for that. Brian, I just wanted to ask you again, question that's come up from our cohort in the past, in terms of maybe best practice when it comes to deciding the initial responsibilities among the founders, and what you see in the US. You work with very early stage medtech startups in the US. Typically, who gets to be the CEO? How are tasks divided between the founders in the early stages of a company as they get incorporated, in your experience?
Yeah, so I would say the founding team often kind of figures it out on their own. So often you'll have a technical founder, somebody who's close to the science or the technology, maybe somebody who's coming from a university or where we're licensing the technology out of, and then another founder who's more on the business side. So when you have that kind of split, it's usually obvious who the CEO is. It's usually going to be the person who's more comfortable managing a team, kind of building a company, talking to investors down the line. It's usually going to be the person with the business background. When you have two technical founders, it kind of comes down to who's more comfortable wearing that hat, and who's going to take on the more, the CTO type role, overseeing the development of the technology. But it's usually something that the founders work out themselves, relatively simply, I would say. And we usually advise folks when it comes to ownership of co-founders to keep it simple and keep things equal. So if you have two founders coming in, kind of bringing similar things to the table, even if one's more business, one's more technical, we usually advise folks to keep the equity the same, own the company 50-50 going in, which will help kind of keep the peace as things get rockier as the company builds.
Great point, and we'll talk a bit about equity and compensation here in a moment. So let's move on to advisory boards, and I'll use that in a relatively broad sense, because for companies that are a little bit more sort of mid-stage, later stage, they may have a scientific advisory board, they may have a business advisory board, and of course they may have their own sort of legal board of directors. If we look at the scientific advisory board, Brian, maybe I'll stay with you on this. Typically, in your experience, what point in time in the development of a medical technology startup should a founder and a CEO start to think about setting up a scientific advisory board if they don't already have one?
So I think it's relatively early on. I think it depends to some extent how developed the technology is when the company begins. As I referenced earlier, some portion of our clients will license technology out of a university. It's already been developed, and the company's kind of ready to build. At that point, it makes sense to get your KOLs involved, so they can start kind of advising you on further R&D efforts, making connections for you across the industry, eventually doing kind of podium talks about your technology. So we'd say it's relatively early in the company's life cycle, and often before we see folks get scientific advisory boards started before they raise funds, because it can be an important part of raising funds, just showing that you've put together an impressive team, an impressive group of advisors, kind of standing behind you, saying, this is good technology.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And Steve, for a medical technology startup, typically, how do they normally go about establishing a scientific advisory board, and how do they best attract maybe key opinion leaders or scientific advisors to that board in the early stages of a company? And a related question, in some cases, we have founders that may be clinicians. So if you have let's say a medical doctor who is the founder, is it then more or less important to have a scientific advisory board? So a few thoughts from you, Steve, on attracting the right people for a board like that, and what a startup should think about.
I think asking the question, what is it you want the board to achieve for you? So if you have in-house scientific knowledge, I'm not sure I see all that much point in adding and paying for extra scientific knowledge outside, unless it's something that you need to complement what is in-house. So there's that's the scientific side. I guess on the business side, it's looking for people who can read and understand where you're coming from, believe that you've got a commercial proposition going forward, and putting a mix of people in there that can assist the executive to basically deliver the outcomes. So if it's science, how do they go about finding them? They will usually do it via their own networks in the smaller markets that I'm exposed to. So again, Asia and Australia, smaller markets, usually there's only one or two levels of connection between people, whether that's via professional networks or whether it's via LinkedIn. Either way, it's not that hard to identify people to attract in. And there's also quite a strong desire, again, geographically specific, it's quite a strong desire out in Australia and in Asia for current executives who are scientifically qualified, or people who are working in institutions and medical institutions and perhaps hospital environments, depending on the product. They're pretty keen to do these things. You know, these things are quite attractive to them. As long as they do their due diligence well, the whole thing actually probably happens organically more than me getting involved. Sort of, you know, I'll often be asked for ideas and could I make referrals and all the rest of it. I'm very rarely engaged professionally to fill an advisory board. So it's often done, it's usually within their own networking community. If it's a specific thing like an orthopedic product, there'll be an orthopedic community. They'll know all the big hitters in there. They'll know all the big KOLs. They know all the, you know, the institutions and so on that are actually researching or working in those spaces. So it's quite an organic thing in this part of the world anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And Brian was earlier talking about having KOLs, on identifying the KOLs and having them do the speaker rounds and podium work and so on. And a key part of this, of course, is compensation. Ultimately, I mean, they many of them may join it for the love and the passion of the science and the technology and the innovation and what ultimately that does to patients, but more often than not they will expect some sort of compensation as well. And Brian, what you do a lot of legal agreements with advisory board members and startups and so on. So you see quite a lot of this in the US. Typically, how are these agreements structured? What are the types of compensation that you see? A small company typically, obviously, doesn't have a whole lot of cash. They can offer equity. There are some pros and cons of that. Are they able to get advisors come in, do pro bono work? Is that a realistic expectation? Your thoughts on that, Brian?
So we don't see a whole lot of pro bono work by advisors, at least not that I know of. You know, when we're brought in, we're usually brought in to put an agreement in place where somebody's at least receiving equity compensation. Sometimes, I'd say a minority of the time, there's a cash compensation component to it as well. A very small minority of the time, it's only cash. But I'd say the large majority of the time, it's equity compensation. That's usually in the form of stock options. The folks are getting a relatively small kind of nominal percentage of the company's capitalization awarded in the form of a stock option to kind of align the scientific advisor with the company and its long-term success.
That's helpful. So again, a couple of questions from our cohort companies that they've queued up earlier. One is whether compensation typically can be based solely on payment per meeting or per time, or is it almost always an expectation to have equity or options that you see, Brian, in the US?
I would say so. That seems to be the expectation from the advisor side and frankly from the company side as well. I have certainly seen arrangements where folks are compensated on a kind of a per meeting basis. where there isn't an equity grant. We're just going to pay you this amount per hour. And it's just going to be a relatively simple arrangement like that. But like I said, most of the time there's an equity component to these compensation arrangements.
Got it. And Steve, what's your perspective here from Australia and the region? What do you see, and what do you think the expectations are?
Certainly there is a smattering of pro bono work done, and remuneration is usually going to be an annual stipend. They'll often use that sort of terminology where it'll be a set amount, and the expectation is you attend X number of meetings out of Y number of meetings, and that's pretty much what it comes down to. But there's also sort of extracurricular outside of meetings activities, so reviewing board papers and maybe reviewing for scientifically appointed people, doing some technical or being asked for advice on something from the chief scientific officer or chief technology officer, whoever's driving the R&D. So I think it's more flat stipend, and then on top of that, there may be, depending on their financial arrangements and where they are and how far advanced they are towards commercialisation, perhaps some equity or a percentage of equity on top as a reward down the track. So if the stipend, considered by the industry to be quite small, so maybe I don't know, I won't put a figure on it because small is relative, but if it's considered to be quite small or an under remuneration for, say, the quality of the person involved and the amount of work they're being asked to do, then equity would some stock options are likely to be added.
Challenge. Thanks for that, Steve. The challenge, of course, with stock options and outright equity compensation is that sometimes those KOLs or advisors won't necessarily stay engaged in the company. And we had the observation here from one of the companies in our cohort saying, I have experience in providing equity over a vesting period, but with the time the physician, the KOL, lost interest, and for political reasons, I didn't want to terminate the agreement. Therefore, I ended up with giving equity to a physician who didn't deliver. How common is that, Brian, and how does one get out of a situation like that legally?
So I'd say that I haven't heard about that particular situation very often. We usually structure our advisor agreements in kind of short-term chunks. So we'll do a term for a year, maybe 2 years. And if the company so desires, we can put it in an auto renewal provision. So if both the advisor and the company want to keep moving forward with the relationship after the initial term, it'll auto renew. But one way to avoid the situation that your cohort member described there is kind of chunking things out in terms of compensation, giving them a relatively small grant for the first year, seeing how things go, and then renewing the agreement, providing another equity grant. But I guess we don't see that problem particularly often. And these equity grants are small to begin with. We're talking about a fraction of a percent. For most advisors, it's usually not a huge amount of equity. And if you're talking about kind of granting people equity early on, it's going to get diluted as you do multiple rounds of financing. So hopefully it wasn't a huge hit for that company.
That's a good point. It does can make a bit of a mess of the cap table, but usually it's not a lot of equity that they give up typically. But just staying with the on the legal side of an agreement with advisors, typically, Brian, what other key legal elements in that agreement should a startup watch out for? I mean, know that there may be some concerns about intellectual property, and I think you've flagged some things to watch out for, especially if you're working with a university employee who may be on an advisory board. Some of your thoughts on that?
Right. So if you're hiring a scientific or any other advisor who is a university employee, it's likely that under university policy, they have an assignment of inventions towards the university. So the university has the first priority. Any intellectual property that the individual, the professor, touches in the course of his or her employment gets assigned into the university. So important to be sensitive to that when you're bringing them on as an advisor, especially if they're going to touch the company's intellectual property in any way. And so our form of scientific advisor agreement gives precedence to the advisor's obligations, their pre-existing obligations to the university. And it can also operate, even if it isn't a university employee, and also operate to give precedence to existing obligations to another company. If that person is primarily working for, X medtech company, and they've already got, assignment obligations towards that company, it can be structured such that the assignment for us kind of takes a backseat to those pre-existing obligations. We want to be careful about that, of course. We want to make sure that we own all of our IP and it's not leaking out through somebody. So there are various disclosure requirements that are built in. You need to tell us what pre-existing obligations you have so we can think through those before we enter into the agreement. But that's a kind of a key legal point that we go through when we're talking about bringing on scientific advisors.
Very helpful, Brian. Thanks for that. Question for Steve, and I don't know if you're able to answer this, but sometimes that we see fairly frequently are startups that put together this group of key opinion leaders, and very often they're a little bit underutilized. They're not engaged enough with the startup and with the company. Are there ways that you see that the chief executive can work better with the scientific advisory board and really maximize the value that he or she has with all those advisors?
You're talking KOLs or advisory boards? So KOLs as in market key opinion leaders.
Yeah,
that the organization is using.
Well, it may be that no, I'm talking about the advisory board. So the advisory board may have one or two KOLs on it, but essentially the advisory board that's put together for that one company.
Yeah, I'm probably not massively experienced in this particular space, but I guess it's a matter of looking at it and saying we need to get value for money, assuming we're paying each of these people. So what is the best way to do that? At what point am I going to start getting resistance by asking them to, say, appear at certain events or to perhaps write a particular piece or support us in some other way? The other way is sort of the reverse way, is actually making sure you're letting the market know, especially your channel or your future channel, that these are the people on our advisory board, and repeat it as an effective marketing exercise. So you can get value out of it that way as well, without the KOL actually having to do all that much more work. So, just making sure everyone knows who's on your board and reinforcing it to your market. So there are a couple of ways that off the top of my head, I can think of that you might get better value out of a KOL or an advisory board member.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and the marketing value, I guess, is one that should not be underestimated. And I think, Brian, you were talking about earlier the potentially the value of the company may go up, or you may be in a better negotiating position with potential investors if you have an impressive advisory board. Is that your experience generally, that ultimately a strong scientific advisory board can even affect valuation of a startup?
Yeah, I think it can to a limited extent. I think a strong group of advisors and a strong core operating team is going to be one factor that investors consider when they're pricing a company. It's one of many, of course. They're going to look at your progress against your milestones, comps in the industry, how valuable they think the technology is going to be upon exit, and so on and so forth. Plenty of other factors. But team is certainly one of them. And to the extent that you've got a strong core operating team advised by important people in the industry, and it looks like they're well connected. And that's one other way that advisors can drive valuation, is by connecting a company to investors throughout the industry and getting multiple term sheets in. That's the way to really drive valuation in a financing round. kind of stirring up additional term sheets and additional investors. And advisors are one way you can garner that kind of interest.
Yeah, thanks. Great point, Brian. Let's talk a little bit about the legal board of directors as opposed to the advisory boards. We do get a number of questions about that as well. Again, Brian, for looking at, based on your experience in the US and working with US startups in the medtech space, what is typical and optimal size of a board of directors for a seed stage or a Series A stage medical technology company? And is there a need at that point in time in the development stage of the company to bring in independent directors? And does the company typically keep those independent directors as the company evolves and grows? What do you see in the US in that area?
Yeah, so the board of directors kind of sets the primary strategic direction for the company. It hires officers hire employees. At the outset, the formation of the company, the board of directors is usually just the founders. As you approach seed financing, you're going to be bringing on investors at that point. Sometimes it behooves the company to put an investor on the board when they do an initial financing, and you end up with, say a board of three. As you move towards Series A, that's when we see most of our clients start thinking about bringing in an independent industry expert director to be another voice in the room and, kind of work with and sometimes counterbalance the voices of the investors on the board. Because once you do a Series A, the most common arrangement we see then is two common directors, which are usually two founders, two investor directors, and then a fifth director who's in the independent role. So that's the most common structure.
That's very helpful. Steve, what's your perspective here from Australia and Asia Pac on board of director composition and in early stages of a company?
Super early stages, I'm probably a little bit limited in experience, but perhaps getting, say, closer towards Series A and further on, the board starts to be treated as something, what does this look like from the outside? So at the beginning, it doesn't. It's just startup. They're getting started. That is, they don't have much profile. Not a million people are looking at them and so on. So, as Brian pointed out, the founders are going to be involved at that stage. But once it gets to the point where they're really starting to hit some scientific goals, and they're starting to move forward and attract some funding and so on, that's when what the board looks like starts to matter quite a bit. Who's on there? What's the balance of experience we've got? Have we got all the bases covered off functionally from a financial risk, so on perspective? In terms of recruiting them, again, Australia and Asia are pretty well known for being within the network, and people who are already on boards get more board roles, and people who've never been on board struggle to get onto their first one. So that's pretty typical. I often speak to incredibly talented individuals who are at the mid to late end of their career, and they're starting to think about what happens when I think about retiring. Should I start getting on some boards now? And they may be chief scientific officer in a listed business now, but they want to get on a board for a startup perhaps in an area that they've got some expertise, some scientific expertise, whatever that is. So what does that person have to do to prepare themselves or make themselves attractive for an organisation to hire them into a director's role when they've had no experience as a director? So in Australia, we've got the AICD, which is Australian Institute of Company Directors, which is a highly, probably one of the world's highest respected director institutes. And they have a fairly comprehensive director program. And that's here, that is, and also, in fact, a lot of directors across Asia have used and do this program through Singapore, through Hong Kong, where it's delivered as well. So it's to become a graduate of the Institute of Company Directors. That's a really good way to put a flag up saying I'm serious about becoming a director. I might be new. And the other way is to get onto non-profit boards, whether they be disease-related, welfare-related, environment-related. It doesn't actually matter. It just gives you a feel. Perhaps even children's school board, those sorts of things can prepare individuals to get board positions, especially that critical first one. And then once you're in the first one, because of the industry and the way it is, and it's everyone, many people know each other, the roll on continues on from there. So from a hiring perspective, that would be my view.
Good, very, very helpful. Brian, we spoke briefly about independent directors or having board of director members that are not investors. For those individuals, typically, what does compensation look like in the US, and what are termination clauses and termination conditions typically for those individuals?
So in the US, for private companies, director compensation is virtually always equity. There's very little cash compensation for private companies. You start getting into significant cash packages once a company goes public. So an independent director, like the rest of the directors, will likely receive a substantial option grant to incentivize them. In terms of termination conditions, I mean, the independent director usually kind of serves at the pleasure of the rest of the boards. And when it comes to the shareholder appointment rights, it's usually a shared designation between the common stock and the preferred stock owned by investors. So the independent director can just be removed at will. And we usually don't have separate contracts in place for directors regarding their tenure with the company and termination and so on. And that may be a distinction between the kind of US companies and the rest of the world, though.
Understood. Thanks for that. Quick reminder to our participant attendees, cohort members, you know how to queue up your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So please go ahead and do that if you got any questions at all, and we'll tackle those in the last 30 minutes of our session here. Let's move on to how companies scale their business and establishing entities overseas, and more specifically, those looking to establish an entity in the US. And Brian, when we work with startup, typically we see that they are looking to the US to set up a local legal entity for one of two reasons: either to raise capital or to build a commercial presence. Are there other major reasons that you see why a non-US medtech startup turns to the US to set up a legal entity, and what are typically the costs, the timelines, and at a high level, what does that process look like?
Yeah, so I think those are the two primary reasons. We'll see an OUS company establishing an entity here, a subsidiary here. It's about capital raising, and sometimes, even we'll see folks establish an entity here and flip it into the parent entity of the company, since US investors will have a preference for investing in kind of the top level parent entity as opposed to into a subsidiary entity. That raises tax considerations that you need to work through with tax advisors. The other reason, like you say, is building a commercial presence. Once you have a substantial team here, useful to have a US kind of operating subsidiary that can employ those folks. In terms of costs, I mean, setting up an entity is relatively cheap, a few $1,000s, not very many hours of work on behalf of your counsel to just establish an entity. The time and expense comes in if you're doing something like I referred to earlier, if you're kind of doing a flip transaction, an inversion transaction, which can be taxable, and then you have to get tax counsel involved, and there may be some exotic structuring that you do to enable that sort of thing. Then the bill could be significantly more, run into the tens of thousands of dollars. But most often, I think we see OUS companies kind of stay OUS as opposed to inverting into the US, given the tax consequences. So just establishing a subsidiary is a relatively simple and inexpensive process.
Very, very helpful, Brian. Thanks for that. And Steve, from from an HR perspective here for a medtech startup that may be based here in Asia Pacific, may already be struggling to find the right talent here in its home market. What are some of the additional challenges in building a team remotely now that they are planning to set up a subsidiary potentially in a market like the US? What are the additional complexities there to think about in terms of talent acquisition?
Significant. It's incredibly challenging, depending where you're coming from as well. So let's say an organisation like a Cochlear, which is an Australian organisation, say based here in Sydney, but global, roughly 2 billion in revenues and so on, and the challenges that they faced establishing themselves, and actually, still struggling to establish themselves in Japan from a people perspective, not from a commercial perspective. They're still struggling because, an Australian company trying to hire a country head in Japan, and the hiring team, none of them speak Japanese. No one has an affiliate, with the market. So how does say a company like a Cochlear identify a country head in a country like Japan? And again, probably the only foolproof way is to basically partner up with a Japanese linked or Japanese enculturated partner, whether that's a search firm or a law firm or whatever. It's just someone who can interpret the market for them locally. Now, for a Cochlear to set up in a US is a little bit less problematic. Obviously, we've got language and cultural things in common that help us. The challenge will be as they are establishing, and I shouldn't keep using Cochlear as an example, but let's take an example of a Cochlear. As they were being established in the 2000s, the sort of things that they faced were that potential American employees just don't know the brand, don't know the name. There's no recognition there, number one, and number two, the technology is so finessed and so specific that oftentimes, and if you ever jump on LinkedIn and have a look at people who have worked at Cochlear, half of them are audiologists. So it's so specific that all that they're in a corner trying to hire, let's say a Eastern Seaboard sales director to get things moving for them, and they're choosing from a population that have never heard of them before, in an area which is cochlear implants, but hearing implants. So in the audio in a very, very specific market. I mean, just by rattling off those challenges, you can see that that's a really big ask. That's really tough, and they did find it. They found it really, really tough. But they've established, they've got there, they're doing okay. So they've built from their commercial launch, which is about 1998, to now and become very, very successful organisations. So that's just an example. Now, if you cross-hatch and look at it, if you're trying to sell, say, a Chinese organisation into the US or into Australia, you will have challenges. If you are trying to, as in starting a Chinese company up in Australia or in the US, where the brands aren't known, where there is still a little bit of mistrust around compliance and other issues, am I prepared to take a risk as an executive with another company to leave where I am and join this new startup? And, without a lot of reassurances, I'm probably not. So they're challenges, they're the big hurdles you've got to get over. You can do it, but it's you're probably just as likely to find someone who has a connection with that market in your own team that exists already, and send them over as, say, not scouts, but trailblazers to get the business going there if they've got the skills. It's very, very complex.
Thanks for that perspective, Steve. One of the things that Brian mentioned earlier was the companies based outside of the US inverting, effectively setting up an entity in the US, and that new entity becomes the parent company for a number of reasons. Is that something that, in your view, Steve, would make it easier? Is it easier to recruit talent to a parent company than to a subsidiary?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, if especially if you're selling the decision maker's not that far away, the real decision maker's not that far away, rather than in another country altogether. And bigger organisations, larger organisations that I've had discussions with where that's been a challenge. So, for instance, a past client of mine is well established in the US, based in Sydney, well established in the US, around about 75% of revenue coming from there, and they struggle from head office here to drive compliance in the US because head office is still here. Now, eventually, will this organisation flick its head office over to the US? I suspect they probably will, because it will be easier to run the business, because that's where the market is. That's where 75% of their current market is. So yes, naturally, it would be. It would probably end up becoming easier. I mean, for the time being, why they haven't made that decision yet, I don't know. They may just have a particular love of the business being an Australian business and keep it that way, rather than sort of reverse selling it back into the US or listing on the New York Stock Exchange at some point.
Understood.
So,
Understood. Brian, what are the alternative legal entities in the US? And typically for a non-US company, how do they evaluate and select them?
Yeah, so we see most of our clients incorporate as corporations, usually Delaware corporations. And that's because venture capital firms like to invest in Delaware C corporations, just given their tax attributes on one hand, and the body of corporate law that is available is kind of a well-established, well-settled, robust body of corporate law in the state of Delaware. The alternative entities are limited liability companies and S corporations, both of which have the advantage and disadvantage of being tax-through entities for tax purposes, or pass-through entities for tax purposes. So if those entities are taxed as partnerships, they essentially pass through their profit or loss to their owners. Corporations don't do that. So with corporations, you run into a double taxation issue. If the company has profits, it gets taxed at the corporate level the first time, and then it gets taxed upon distribution or dividend out to the stockholders. That's not an issue for most of our companies, because most medtech companies don't have profits. They have a bunch of losses. Venture capitalists don't want to take pass-through tax treatment. They want to avoid something called unrelated business income tax. And often their formation documents for their funds, their LPs or limited partners who invest into the venture fund, prohibit them from investing in pass-through entities. So we see, I'd say 99% of our companies that we incorporate at Wilson Sonsini are C corporations, and they're usually domiciled in the state of Delaware.
Understood. And for companies outside of the US that are setting up those types of entities, do they typically do that inversion that you mentioned? Has that become the general expectation amongst investors in the US that if they're investing in a company outside of the US, they expect the company to set up its global headquarters in the US and move key executives to the US?
Yeah, so I'd say at the early stages, we've seen some investors kind of demand it. You know, they're not comfortable investing in an OUS startup for whatever reason, and the company's early enough and its value is low enough that the tax consequences of doing the inversion, because there can be kind of paper income to the company's founders when you do an inversion like that into a U.S. entity, the company's value may be low enough where the tax consequences are relatively small. So in those situations, yes, we've seen investors kind of require a company to invert. At a later stage, where the tax consequences and just the practicalities of doing the flip are much greater, and the company is valuable, it's an attractive investment for a VC here, you usually find a way to invest in that startup outside of the United States without doing the whole inversion process. So I don't want to give you the impression that we do inversions all the time, because we don't. They can be complicated and inexpensive.
Understood. That's helpful, Brian. Steve, one of the things that we we see very often is, let's say, a startup company in this part of the world, they may have a significant fundraise, raise 10 million, $20 million. And then typically the expectations from their new investors and on the new CEO or on the existing CEO is to very quickly scale the business, to look at ways to expand the team, to go overseas, and so on. What are some of the leadership challenges during that phase? Is that so different that the company really very often needs a whole different set of leadership skills and needs to think about whether its CEO is the right person for the job?
Yes, it is. It is a challenge, and a number of CEOs, if they're also the founder of the technology, they're the one driving the technology as well, and they want to stay on as CEO and continue to run the business. A number of people have done that and been very successful doing that as well. Most will struggle because of the skills that are required in order to start a business up and to be a trailblazer are very different from taking a business from, say, $10 to $20 million to 50, then to 200 to $1 billion, and so on. The skills are quite different. You're on a bigger stage, you've got a bigger audience. Not everyone's a direct report anymore. So all of those things factor in. And you still have all your other responsibilities. You're still overseeing, financial management of the business, your commercial side, your relationships with your KOLs in the market, your investors if you're starting to bring on quite a few of those. So all those relationships have to keep going. I would say if there's a common denominator for trailblazers who have gone on to become successful business growers, and we all know the names of the very high profile ones, of course, but for every high profile one that's actually made it, there's probably, 100 that have failed. Failed to get it there. It doesn't mean the business failed, but recognition by the board, we need to change the CEO, or the CEO needs to become the chief scientific officer, because that's where he or she started. So what it comes down to is, I think if you were to say what are the common attributes of those who have succeeded in taking the business all the way through from, say, 0 to 100 million, then the attribute is likely to be in the ability of those people to both delegate, to both hire really effectively and to delegate really effectively. So to engender loyalty from people, to have people, really get behind them, believe in the vision, and have everyone sort of, heading in the same direction. Now, for someone to have had their eye on a microscope and to have found a molecule, or to have discovered a particular way of redesigning a new replacement hip in orthopedics, whatever it is, whether they're an engineer or a biological scientist, that's a big ask to be able to take that step up. And there will be a point in most companies as they grow where the board will step in and they will say, we now need a strong commercial leader and a strong people leader to be able to move into this next stage. And I'm familiar with one organisation where the CEO joined at about, and I'm sorry, it's a little bit further down the track than most of your audience are going to be used to, but just to give you a feel, I think the themes are still valid. He joined at, the business was turning over about 20 million. It's currently turning over around about 155, and that's since about 2015. So done reasonably well, and with a new product to augment the product they already have in the market. And he's really struggling with the next stage of going from a $150 million business to his goal of $500 million in 3 to 5 years, and the difference in the way that business needs to be run. Just as he was coming from mainstream industry as a business unit director into a head of marketing for a listed medtech, into a CEO of another listed medtech, but much smaller. So he's had to make all those adjustments as well. But now he's hitting another hurdle. How do I take this from 150 to 500? Remain relevant to investors, and also remain relevant to the analysts. Because convincing them I can still do it, I'm still the guy, I'm, in this case it's a male, but could be female as well. To convince them of all of that is, that's a tough thing. If he's still there at $1 billion, I'll take my hat off to him.
That's really really helpful, and I guess related to that as well. And this may have been the case with the person that you referred to here. A question that sometimes we see come up with smaller companies is whether they should look to recruit from a large multinational. Getting someone into a startup environment, given the culture and everything else that comes with that territory. Uh, is it relatively straightforward? Is it manageable to bring someone in from a big strategic, big multinational with essentially no startup experience to come in as a head of commercial sales or head of technology or even a CEO? Is it a good idea? Is it not a good idea? And how can those individuals be sort of coached into that role if that's what the company decides to do? Steve.
The CEO is saying to herself or himself, my best friend over at XYZ MedTech, who's the head of sales, would be a really good head of sales for me in my business. That's a mistake, right? I just upfront, I'll tell you that's probably not the right decision to make because it's a personal decision. The answer to it is it can definitely work, and it's all down to the candidate, the person they're looking at bringing across. So if it's someone who can demonstrate flexibility, can work in a far less siloed, far less compliant, corporate compliant, in the way that corporations behave and blue chip companies behave internally, to be able to come across to something that might be a little bit more ramshackle, a little bit less formal, a little bit they're not carrying their previous company's business card anymore. They're carrying the business card of a company that may not be recognizable. So all of those things are going to dictate whether an individual is going to be able to make the transition. And every single brief I take that goes along these lines, whether it's a clinical role, clinical affairs, sales and marketing, whatever it is, it always comes up. And I ask the question, will you look at big med tech or will you look at big pharma for this role? And 50% will say 100% not. I don't want anyone from that sort of environment because they'll just never adapt to here. 2 or 3 times we've done it in the past and it's failed really badly. And 50% will say, I'll have a look at it, but the person has to be adaptable, a really good fit. So I'll give you an example. Look, an example of that is if you got someone early enough in their career and brought them out, I'm not going to name names, but let's say early enough that they are still in that phase of being adaptable. Right? They can adapt to a new environment and they've got a highly entrepreneurial mindset, and they're driven by highly entrepreneurial things that they feel being in a corporate is holding them back. Now, that could be a good person. The other good person could be someone who is perhaps closer to the end of their career and they're prepared to take a financial risk because their corporate career is coming to an end. They've seen it all. They've done a lot. Their ambitions aren't, I want to get to be the most senior person in the organisation anymore. So their motivations are different. They may come across and take a pay cut and in return for some equity or some options down the track that pay out when things go well. And if you can find someone who, it's a classic example is people who retire and then go and buy a Jim's Mowing franchise. That sort of thing. You retire from the bank and go and buy a Jim's Mowing franchise. This is a version of that. It's a more corporate version of it, but it's similar. Going from a recognised, big brand, a company like a Medtronic or a Boston Scientific, and joining an XYZ company that no one's heard of, on the chance that there might be an upside down the track for me, career-wise, if I'm a young person, financially, if I'm close to closing in on retirement in 5 to 10 years anyway. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. That's very helpful, Steve. Thanks for that. We're almost wrapping up here. I wanted to ask you for just a few closing words as well. Maybe before we do that, I'll just turn to Brian here for a second and just ask you, in terms of pitfalls to avoid for startups that are looking to set up an entity in the US, what are some of the big watch outs that companies should really be careful about when turning to set up an entity in the US?
Yeah, so I would say that they're primarily tax driven. From a legal perspective, setting up a subsidiary, like I mentioned, is a relatively straightforward thing. To the extent that you're going to be employing people, at that level, makes sense to coordinate with your tax advisors on kind of how the employment relationships are going to work, and how payroll is going to work, and so on and so forth. This may be different from what you're used to elsewhere. If you're considering the inversion transaction that we talked about earlier, that is, can be a highly expensive, time-consuming transaction. Best to work with your tax advisors and tax counsel, and also coordinate with your investors, the investors who are going to be investing into the new entity, and your existing shareholders, and get everybody on the same page about that kind of transaction. That can be a real pitfall. If you move forward with it, start investing and putting the structure together, and then some key stakeholder, whether it's an existing investor, a large holder, or your new investor, isn't on the same page with you about what the structure looks like. So I'd say it's a matter of coordination with kind of key stakeholders when you're setting up an entity in the US.
Very, very helpful, Brian. And we are coming to the close here. Brian, to stay with you, any other words of advice to the cohort companies that are here? And can I ask you as well, are you okay for us to share your email address and contact details with the 24 cohort companies so they can reach out to you? You okay with that?
Of course. Yeah. Please do. I'm happy to talk to folks completely free of charge anytime about any of this stuff. So we talked about a couple different things here tonight. I mean, setting up a scientific advisory board is mostly going to be an internal matter for the company. It's a matter of, as Steve referenced, kind of something that you work through with your network. In terms of the documentation, your law firm can provide you a form of advisor agreement that you can use with your scientific advisors and other folks. Makes sense to, once you have somebody kind of ready to onboard, makes sense to coordinate with your legal team about what the compensation package looks like for that person. If there are any questions around the IP assignment provisions that we talked about earlier, that's a time to get your legal team involved. But otherwise, it's kind of going to be you off to the races, going out and engaging advisors on your own. And when it comes to setting up an entity in the US, if you're a foreign incorporated entity, that's something that you want to talk about the process with your legal team kind of when you first start considering it. Basically, talk with your legal and tax advisors early on in that process. Get some advice, and don't spin your wheels, because it can be a complex and time-consuming process.
Right. Thanks for that, Steve. And Brian and Steve. Final words of advice from you to our cohort, and I'll ask you the same question. Are you all right for us to share your contact details with our cohort companies so they can reach out to you? And few closing thoughts as well.
Sure thing. Yeah, of course. Share widely. More than happy to speak with anyone. And again, I don't charge either. You've just got to tell me a good joke and you get me for half an hour. No, seriously, two bits, final parting pieces of advice. One is, let's say, for instance, you're in that situation you mentioned before, Frederick, you've just raised $10-20 million and you're getting excited and salivating about the prospects of what comes next. What do we do next? The first thing I would say is, don't write your organizational design down and then try and hire to it. It's probably one of the biggest mistakes organizations make. What I mean by that is, don't have preconceived notions of the person you want in this role you want to hire, right? So let's say you're hiring a person who's going to head up your commercial business, a head of sales and marketing, or someone who's going to be running the business. Don't have a preconceived idea of what that person should be based on your past experiences. The best idea is to speak widely about people, talk about the sort of skills that you're looking for, what you need, what sort of temperament do you need, what sort of knowledge base experience do you need, people leadership do you need, and as you talk to people and continue that conversation, or use an executive search firm, which is the best practice way to go, by the way. Nevertheless, people will be referred to you, and you'll look at their CVs and you'll say, man, this is a little bit left field compared to what I was thinking. But the number of times those left field people get hired because they bring stuff I didn't even know existed. Right? they have skills, experiences, knowledge. They may even know a market that you weren't even thinking about going to. But now that you have someone who knows that market, I now have another market to go to. It's like the facets of a diamond. It can really shoot off and the light can hit anywhere. So keep an open mind and be flexible. Do your org chart in reverse. Hire people as you come across them, because it's attitudes, attitude to life, energy, intellect, all of those things are the ones that are going to make them successful in their role. Actually, not their CV. It's the person sitting in front of you that's going to make that difference. So that's probably the biggest one. The other one is just around not being scared of taking a chance on people or someone perhaps a lot less senior than what you're after, but has all of those packaged up that I just mentioned to you before. So the attitude is in the right place, the fire in the belly and all that sort of thing. And bring them in, and they may be too junior for the role, but bring them in and give them a go. Firstly, there's a financial upside to it, because, you put them on a 3-month probation, they work out, take off, they can grow, and then you can compensate them appropriately. So that's the other one. I know it doesn't sound like it's too important one, but to hire a young, I've seen it quite often, hiring someone 5-6 years off the pace of what you want in terms of experience, I've seen made up for by the fact that they pick up where they need to be, and within a year are where you need them to be, because they know what they've got to learn. It's clear. And so long as you mentor them well and look after them, that can be a very rewarding way to hire as well. And it's easier than trying to hire to a specification.
Great advice. Thank you so much for that, Steve, and thanks, Brian. Thanks both of you for an engaging conversation. It's been a great panel. Do stay on. We're going to go into Q&A in just a moment. We're slightly behind time here, but not to worry. I will ask Bernice to disconnect us from YouTube. Thank you to our YouTube viewers. Join us again next week when we will be talking about clinical